Welcome to Brew House. We are so glad that you have joined us. This is a weekly podcast and videocast series. We make fun of bad coffee. We love drinking good coffee. And more importantly, we really enjoy discussing and answering the tough questions that you guys, our wonderful audience, are asking us each and every week. So look forward to you guys tuning in. Every single week, we are going to answer a different question and just give you some of our thoughts and ideas around it. We would love participation, so please feel free to comment, email us, provide us feedback. We want to hear from you because this is only as good as the questions you ask. Well, welcome back to Brew House.
Hello.
This is Shane. I am Brennan. This is episode 2 of season 2. And today we are going to be talking about faith through community. But before we get there, like every episode, we are going to start off with a delicious cup of coffee. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that today?
So this coffee came to us by way of Vancouver Island.
Love Vancouver Island.
I have a good friend there. His name is Curtis Winkrink. Him and his family are just great people.
Thank you, Curtis.
Yes, worked with his dad at New Life, great church. And they were in my small group. And there's this great coffee heaven.
Okay,
Mecca.
Coffee Heaven.
Yes.
If you ever wondered where Coffee Heaven was, it's on Vancouver Island.
And it's this place called Drum Roasters. And it's family owned. It's family operated.
Yep.
And they were the first coffee shop that really taught me about coffee.
You mentioned last week they were the ones that took you off Starbucks.
Absolutely.
All right.
And now I am forever off Starbucks.
Yeah, you can't drink it.
If I can, for sure. And these guys, actually, they roast their own coffee in shop.
Nice.
They're very community-oriented, the whole 9 yards. I actually took a coffee brewing class there.
Wow.
Which was amazing. Learned a lot. But their coffees are primo.
Yep.
And when I moved from Vancouver Island to Calgary, there were a couple of things, several things I was mourning. My friends, my church, warmer weather.
all of the good things.
Yes. And believe it or not, I was mourning the loss of leaving Drum Roasters.
There you go. Well, it has come back to you.
It has. And so today, one of the packages that they've sent us is a gold label seasonal espresso.
I do love an espresso roast.
Yes, espresso is great. Now, this one has notes of coca, panela, stone fruit. Now, I have no clue what that is, but it sounds good.
Sounds very exotic.
But before we get to taste it, I want Brennan to talk a little bit about something that I think for people who maybe are breaking into the coffee world, something that they really want to know. And so I'm actually going to pour a few of these out here.
Okay.
So that maybe, I don't know if you guys can see that
for those on YouTube, they might not be able to see that far, but what we want to highlight for people is, and this is something people have asked me a number of times, what makes a premium coffee? What's different between your Folgers and a small batch coffee like this? Well, there's a couple things. One, when you do large batch roasting, you typically have to roast for a longer period of time. So large batch companies, they kind of have just a default. They throw it all into a massive industrial size roaster. They turn it on to a certain temperature and they just let it go. Small batch roasting, you have the ability to kind of watch it a little bit more. Pamper it. You're not roasting it as long, depending on the type of bean, depending on what's with the bean. What Shane was highlighting here is the bean on this one, it didn't have a sheen to it.
Right.
And so if you ever come across a coffee bean and it looks clean, one, you don't want a dark coffee bean. Unless you love dark roast coffee.
If it's a black-looking bean,
you're going to get a black-looking coffee.
Yes.
Right? But a very lightish brown bean with no sheen to it means there's not a lot of additives.
Right.
It means there's not a lot of chemicals. And it means that it's been roasted for the appropriate amount of time. If you roast a bean too long, it'll actually cook all the oil out of it, and it'll sit on the surface.
Right. And so, like, when I go and I try to pick out coffee at different places, and if I have a chance to actually see the bean and I see that it's shiny, I don't go for it.
Don't touch it.
Right. Absolutely. Get away from it, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just not that good. But this stuff, like it's almost what I'd call flat. It's like a flat brown color.
Yep.
And that's what you want to look for.
That's what you want to look for. Should we give it a taste?
And so I think we should before it gets too cold. Now, I did perk this in our famous Belletti.
Yep.
The one we did Folgers in, and I assure you that it's going to be a different experience.
A Belletti's really good for an espresso roast.
Yes.
Because it brings all the notes out.
Yes, but not just for espresso.
Just for espresso.
Yes,
all right, let's
sure.
give it a hit. Ooh.
Wow.
What do you think of that?
I actually like it. It's intense.
That has a lot of flavor.
It's intense. It has a lot of flavor. But one of the things, and I don't know what this stone fruit is that they're talking about there, but it almost reminds me a little bit of a spicy note.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying? It almost has a little bit of a spicy note with it. I could actually see this coffee in like used on like a flat white or a traditional macchiato that adds a little bit of the milk in it. This would be absolutely outstanding to go with that. So this, espresso for me, I'm not a huge fan of it unless it's a flat white or a macchiato. Because I find that it's kind of like a one-noter.
Right.
And a lot of times it's burnt.
Yeah.
Right?
Usually you're going to add like a heavy cream or a milk to kind of balance out that burnt taste.
Yes.
Whereas this one, that would really accentuate it. It's going to really bring it into balance.
This has a lot of different it's got a deep flavor profile.
It's still sitting there.
But it's not like a hit. So like if you're looking for something like midday, I think, pre-supper.
If you love espresso, I would say this is a fantastic espresso. It's not one you're just going to sip all day, but it's one that if you want to make a specialty coffee, if you like those types of drinks, this is going to be an excellent one for you.
I would actually love to have this in a flat white.
We might have to try that in another episode.
Exactly, because this is really good espresso, which I would expect from Drum Roasters. Those guys are top notch.
So Drum Roaster Coffee, gold label seasonal espresso. That's a good espresso.
Yes, and you can order this online and they will deliver it to you. Outstanding coffee shop, great people, community involved. Curtis, thank you for sending this. And over the next few weeks, I think we're actually going to be drinking some Drum Roasters coffee.
They were very generous. They sent us a taster's pack, if you will, with a couple varieties, different roasts, different flavors. So we're going to go through all of them because we love coffee and they sent us coffee. So, we'll definitely be including links to all the products and how to find them on our podcast and YouTube pages. So if you guys want to go check out Drum Roasters, thank you, Curtis. Thank you, Drum Roasters. We'll definitely be sending you guys your
well done
way.
Espresso, guys. Thank you.
Go. All right, we're going to enjoy our cup of coffee for a second, and we'll be right back.
All right, so welcome back. We had to take a few minutes just to enjoy that espresso that we had from Drum Roasters. And now we're going to launch into the topic for today, and it's faith through community. Now, it's not faith in community. I think that would be a different topic. But faith through community. And I think you'll see why that's an important distinction here in just a few minutes. So last week we really talked about faith and as a kind of an add-on, we talked about culture.
Right.
And kind of how faith informs us. Faith for us is an action. It's something, I'm putting my faith in something that is really kind of dictating or laying a path for me on how I'm going to live my life.
That's right. Faith informs us and drives us towards something.
Right.
Or hopefully someone.
Now, we said this last week, and which it's true, everybody has faith.
Everybody
does.
Faith. Faith is almost an intrinsic part of life. Whether we recognize where it is or not, we all put faith in something or someone. We put faith in people. We put faith in things. We put faith in
institutions.
Yes. Or we put faith in things beyond ourselves, whether that be a deity, whether that be religion, whether that's spirituality.
The universe.
Faith is a part of us.
Yes.
Right? That's where I was going with that.
Okay, all right. Yeah. I didn't want to cut you off there.
You're not cutting me off.
Right. So anyway, now we're going to talk about faith through community. So how really would a community look like with faith interjected into it? How would a faith community maybe look like? How do we connect with people?
Right.
What do those connections do for us?
Well, and so in the first season, the question was how do we develop faith in community? That was kind of the premise, right? And our answer was, the question was, how do we develop faith, right? Where do you build that? And for us, it happens in community, right? Well, how does that actually happen? That's more what we're going to go through kind of today of faith through community comes out in certain places. And
we're going to broaden community. So when we say community here, sometimes I think our default is, well,
small group,
church community or small group community. No, we're talking about an expanded version of community, maybe where you live, where you work, where you do go to church, all of those things.
We should be clear. The reason why this is titled Faith Through Community, again, for us, this is an action process. Faith is it is an action word. It requires us to move somewhere. And so faith through community, it's us looking at how to actually develop our faith, grow our faith, expand what we know or what we want to learn, and how that actually takes process through the people around us, right? And as you mentioned, we're going to broaden that. So we don't want people to think, well, this has to happen in your immediate circle. It can, but faith through community can be anywhere.
But sometimes if it's just your immediate circle, your faith doesn't grow.
Right.
And I don't know how we are at being human if we don't expand that circle somewhat.
Yep.
So I was thinking along this as we were preparing, and there was an example that jumped out in my mind that I think maybe we could share this, and then maybe that'll give an idea of what we're talking about. So you heard last week, Brendan and I talking about this guy named Paul. And Paul wrote a lot of the books that we have in our scriptures.
Right.
And some would argue that maybe, Luke wrote more words.
Yep.
But Paul definitely wrote more
letters,
books, right? Yeah. More letters. And Paul traveled around a lot through the Greco-Roman Empire in the first century. I mean, he was in a lot of cities, a lot of different provinces.
Paul was everyone's favorite pen pal.
Yeah, I mean, Paul was everywhere. And everywhere he went, he got a reaction.
Because he had something to say.
Exactly. Whether positive or negative, he got a reaction. But I think one of the formation pieces for me on this idea of faith through community comes out in a passage in Acts. So this guy named Luke wrote the book, but in this book, in this story, he's talking about Paul.
Right.
Because he hung out with Paul. He traveled with Paul. And so Acts 17, Paul is in Athens. And for those of you that don't know, Athens at the time was kind of like a mecca of philosophy. Just really the center of Greek and Roman culture was in Athens. And Paul was there, and like Paul usually does, he goes to this place named the synagogue, which is like kind of these open air places where you could talk about things that maybe not many people cared about a lot of times.
But you could talk about them.
Yeah, exactly. But Paul went there and he was talking about things about Jesus and about faith and how that guides his life. And it says not only did he do it there, but he also did it in the marketplace. So he's having conversations with people. He's not on a soapbox yelling. They didn't have mics back then, but he wasn't yelling with a paper megaphone or anything like that. He was having conversations.
You mean
with
he
people.
wasn't sitting on a street corner with a big sign and a megaphone
saying you're going to hell?
Yeah,
no,
Jesus is coming, repent.
No, he didn't do any of that.
Okay, just checking.
Because they probably would have killed him.
They would have.
They ended up killing him, but that would have got it much sooner.
Yeah, it would have expedited the process.
Exactly. And so there was these guys that, as they were walking by, this group of people heard him speaking and heard him talking and having conversations with people. And they said, you know what? Hey, we want you to come to Mars Hill. Now, Mars Hill is like the pinnacle of philosophical debate. And they invited him to come there and to speak with them and for them to dialogue about this new, if I can say it this way, this new philosophy that he was putting forward. Now, here's the cool thing. When Paul went there, he actually did what we talked about last week. He took faith and culture and he put them together. So when he went there, he didn't go, you know what, guys, Athens is a horrible place. You guys are a bunch of pagans. He didn't do that. He actually went in and said, hey, this city is awesome. And I can look around and see that you guys are highly spiritual. You got a high level of spirituality that you appreciate. You appreciate dialogue around that. And so he's bringing out, again, this idea of some of the beauty of the culture. As Paul's walking around, he sees this one image of God called the unknown God. And so he says, let me tell you about that God. And then he proceeds to share this story of faith about Jesus and about how it shaped his life. But he didn't do it in a, if I can say it, like an anti-you way. He did it through embracing the culture, the city, the people, and sharing that story. And so his faith was worked out not just through the people he was traveling with, but it also encompassed random people, people in the marketplace, people in the synagogue, and then eventually this high level of philosophical debate. Paul was invited to be part of that process. It wasn't adversarial.
Yeah, what Paul did was he really guided people through a process of what we would now call biblical community.
Yes.
Right? Is he was demonstrating how we can come together and be focused on a singular motivation, right? That being Jesus, and allow that to drive what we do. Now, it's important for people to understand that wasn't the only drive those people had. Right? They had other things, like you were just mentioning. There was other aspects of the culture in Athens that would have driven people other places besides Jesus. He wasn't concerned with that. He encouraged them to just focus on Jesus and allow that to pull their attention towards him. He did the same thing everywhere he went. And everyone's culture was a little bit different around the area. Where it pulled them was different, whether it be different faiths, whether it was different practices, didn't matter. He was just encouraging, let's come together in community, let's talk about Jesus, let's ask questions. And there was a process for that, right? Acts is a great book because it highlights a couple things about biblical community. One is devotion. Right? So Paul he didn't really pull any punches on it. If you're going to belong in this community, then you got to belong. You have to invest and devote yourself to this community. You can't be 50% in and still be invested elsewhere and expect to get something out of this community.
And I think this is important to interject. Now, a lot of times they go, oh, they're talking about Christianity. But with Paul, you have to understand, and this is profound. This is a different way to think about this. They didn't call him a Christian.
No.
They said he was a person of the way. And it was a way of living life differently than maybe what communities were embracing. And so they just said, you know what? These people are like selling things and giving their money to the poor and helping people. They're just living a different way. And I think that's an important distinction. People weren't going, oh, he's a Christian. No. They were like, this guy's living different. He's talking different. He's acting different. He's actually tolerant of people that some of us might even shy away from.
Yeah, I mean, when Scripture says that we will be known by the way we love. Right? That's what Paul was focused on in the book of Acts. And I love the book of Acts because of how it brings out this idea of biblical community. And that is the second aspect that Paul really dives into, and that is compassion. If you're going to live in community, if you want to experience faith through community, you have to be compassionate and really expand on how much compassion you have. Because living in community is going to be messy. If your community isn't messy, if it's not complicated, if it's easy, you need to find a new community to invest in, because community and faith through community is not going to come through easy conversations. It's not going to come through easy people, as much as we might love that to happen. Faith through community requires that we expand our ability to love others and really extend forgiveness the way that Christ has extended forgiveness to us.
Now, this is, I think what you just said is critically important. So I'm going to out myself in a way here.
Okay.
And say that I actually don't call myself a Christian.
Right.
I don't. And you can go to my Facebook profile, my Instagram profile. You can talk to people at church. I call myself a Jesus follower.
Yeah.
Because sometimes Christianity is not really follow Jesus.
Right.
It's actually followed anti-Jesus, right? And so I call myself a Jesus follower. And what that means is that I am trying the best way I can in the current moment to live my life according to the way that I see Jesus. Now, the cool thing is Jesus is ever expanding.
Yep.
Because of the work that we do in community or the associations that we have in community. But one of the things that Paul was modeling is what he saw in Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus had a very interesting community of people. Very interesting community of people.
Don't you wish you could go back and just experience part of that community?
I wish I could be a fly on the wall to hear all the dialogue.
Oh.
Because, I mean, here's a guy who his inner circle consisted of guys that were sympathetic to the Roman Empire.
Yep.
All the way to guys who wanted to murder the Roman Empire and everybody associated with the Roman Empire. He had demon-possessed people hanging out with him that were no longer demon-possessed.
Yep.
I mean, he had prostitutes.
He had women. Yeah, he had women in his inner circle, which was considered like
hugely taboo, right? Hugely taboo back in the day. As a matter of fact, the first apostle that Jesus had was a woman.
Yep.
Apostle means sent one. Mary Magdalene at the tomb. He says, go tell my brothers, which is hugely taboo.
Yeah.
So Jesus reshaped this idea of faith and community because faith in Jesus' time, they actually looked at him and said, why is your teacher sitting with such scum?
Yeah.
Their faith was isolation.
Yeah.
Jesus' faith was involvement. And I think that's what we see modeled with Paul, which I think, as you were saying, as Jesus followers, we can't say we're not going to be compassionate.
No.
We're not going to be caring. We're not going to be loving. No, Jesus is actually involved to the point where they're his associates.
Yeah. Well, and it's not just compassion. It is compassion literally extended to others. There is a unique aspect about compassion that I don't know if people maybe recognize as much, but people rarely experience compassion outside of community. Mm-hmm. It is maybe a human phenomenon, you could call it, but compassion requires investment, right? And so typically compassion is extended when you've built relationships with people, when you're invested in their lives, and you want to see the best for them. Where we've tended to maybe err in church culture, if I can say, is we've now constructed communities that are insular.
Absolutely.
And so our communities now are the same communities they've always been. And so we're just extending compassion to the same people and over. And there's value there. Mm-hmm. But when that community doesn't evolve, when that community doesn't change, it's really difficult to show compassion to other people because they're on the outside and we see them outside of our community and we say, oh, I really, I'm praying that God loves them. and I look at that and I say, well, yeah, he wants you to love them.
Exactly.
Right? And that is what compassion requires of us, right? If we lose our job, if we're in a hospital, if we see, right, we've just gone through COVID, we've had good friends of ours struggling.
Are we through it?
Well, we're in COVID.
Okay.
We've seen people go through cancer struggles, in our circles recently. And all around that, people around them show incredible compassion. Mm-hmm. And what I would say to that is that is awesome. Mm-hmm. That is community,
right?
The way it's intended. Why don't we show that level of compassion for those outside and bring them in? Because what Paul is highlighting for people, and this is what he demonstrated, he brought people in the same way Jesus brought people in. Right. Jesus didn't go to the tabernacle. Jesus didn't go to the synagogues. He didn't go to the place where all the Jews lived and said, okay, you're my people. Let me take care of you. Mm-hmm. He just went out and found people and said, I want to love you. I want to take care of you.
Yep.
Right?
And I think what you're pointing on is huge. And we actually talked about this in our first season, is that through COVID, what we were noticing is that some people were invested, but only invested where they were receiving a return.
Right.
And that's not the way a Jesus community would function. And what you said is interesting, is that a lot of times compassion happens from inside of a group. And one of the things that I think you and I would agree on that was, and we're still troubled by it, is some of the factors around COVID and precautions and bylaws and everything else, is this idea of isolation.
Yep.
And so there are people who are truly alone. And when you're alone, and even most introverts would say they've had enough of being alone.
Yep.
That there's a certain point where that can spiral downward.
Yep.
And so you have to have a community. You have to have something to kind of show you compassion and love, but also raise you up.
Yep.
If I can say, to a different level of existing versus on a downward spiral,
yep.
right? And I think that's the beauty of what Jesus did. Jesus, yes, came from the outside in, but he stayed in.
Yeah.
And I think that's the beautiful piece that we as a church organization, churches as a whole, people of faith, Jesus followers, need to remember is that we don't have the option of, once we go in, to say, okay,
too messy.
I did my thing, I'm out. No. You're in. Stay in.
Yeah. Well, and I think so. Both devotion to community and compassion in community, those are incredibly difficult things to practice day in and day out. Mm-hmm. They can become exhausting, right? But what we even see in the person of Jesus is this ability to say, this is tough. Let me return to my Father. Let me seek wisdom from my Father. Let me seek, whether it was revitalization, encouragement. He always would root himself in his Father's teachings, in prayer, in time in isolation, in meditation, in this ability to say, there's a lot of work over here.
Right.
And whether we maybe recognize it or not, Jesus talks about how frustrating the disciples were. Right?
I love that one phrase. How much longer do I have to put up with you guys?
Right. That community that he developed wasn't an easy community for him, but he recognized the power that it had. And to do that, it really required him to invest in his own self in order to do that. And so I don't want to miss that, because COVID has been incredibly difficult for us.
Yes.
And I've had a couple people ask me recently, how do I build community right now? How do I actually accomplish this task of the kingdom of God, of my Christian faith, this idea that I'm supposed to go out and love people and take care of people, because I can't do any of that right now. And my answer to them has been, then take care of yourself right now. Invest in yourself. That you can still love people right now, just not the same ways, but you can take care of yourself, and you can really focus on developing your own ability by spending time with the Father, growing in wisdom, growing in compassion, so that when we have the ability to go out and invest in community, that we're ready to do so.
Right. And I think it's also about morphing.
Yeah.
Right? It's also about morphing the way that we do love. And so, one of the things that we've had conversations around here, which is not unique to us, everyone's having this conversation, is how do we build a deeper sense of community on our online presence with the stuff that we're doing virtually, et cetera. And some of that has been well received, and some of it hasn't been so well received. And so I think we're all in this place of trying to figure things out, but it's not I think what you just said is a non-negotiable, and being involved in people's lives is a non-negotiable.
Yep.
We just might have to navigate a new way
of accomplishing
doing that. But I do think we've kind of hinted around to something here that I think that unfortunately this used to be my mindset. It's no longer my mindset. I learned a lot when I was at New Life, Vancouver Island, Drum Roasters,
Love
Curtis. One of the things that I learned there, working with First Nations people,
right,
that was really important for me. And it was life-shifting, that I think all people of faith need to work through this, and Jesus followers, is that we have a tendency sometime in church culture to view everything outside of church culture adversarially.
Yep.
So because a person believes different than me, looks different than me, acts different than me, that they're my adversary. There's nothing that I can appreciate there or learn there, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what we see with Jesus and Paul and the apostles is that they didn't view people adversarially.
Yeah.
They had this idea of being for people, and they engaged with people to make their lives better.
Well, and so, okay, this goes back to the compassion piece, and it ties into the next thing that Paul really highlights in Acts, and that is we can become adversarial when we are unable to extend compassion towards those people. Right? When we don't have the ability to look at them and love them, and now we're responding to the things that we disagree upon, and we allow that to become a barrier rather than a motivator, right? It means we're not invested enough in their life. And so what Paul highlights is community requires frequency. It's a non-negotiable. You can't have one without the other, right? The early church didn't let things get in the way of their meeting. And you could argue that they had less distractions than we do today. And that may be true, but they also had fewer conveniences. They had less ways to actually engage. They had less resources to engage with one another, right? So today, this sounds something like, I'll engage in community, I'll engage in relationship, only if, a friend calls me and wants me to go for dinner. Or I'll engage in community if my favorite sports team is playing.
Yep.
Then I'll go engage in community. Or, the weather's nice today, so I'll go and engage with the community over there. Or, I'm not going to engage in community because I have a busy work weekend. Well, in other words, we'll engage in community if nothing better comes along, right? Community then becomes something that we do on the side because we're looking after what? Ourselves.
Right.
And it turns from a community focus to an individualistic focus.
Absolutely.
And that can be incredibly destructive, right? Everybody wants friends, but nobody wants frequency.
So 2 questions.
Yep.
All right. That come out of that. And I think I know where your answer's going. If not, I'll help you become right.
Good. I need a lot of help with that.
Yes.
That's what my wife tells me.
Yes. So if I'm in a situation with a person, you alluded to this a few minutes ago, if I'm in a situation with a person and I find myself unable to love that person, whose fault is that? Mine or theirs?
Mine.
Exactly. But we don't see it that way.
No, but that's because we've very much embraced this individualistic mindset, right? So frequency means I'm going to put a community mindset above an individualistic mindset. And in our self-made culture, that kind of rubs us the wrong way because now we're not getting what we want out of it, right? And then it becomes about us. And yet frequency increases intimacy in community, and intimacy in community will provide us what we're looking for.
Right.
But we kind of want to skip ahead to get out of it what we want without putting anything
Exactly.
Right? And so there's a phrase that I've seen a couple times. I have it written down in a couple different places. But everybody wants friends. Nobody wants frequency. Frequency increases intimacy and community.
Right.
And that is something that Paul demonstrated. It's something Jesus demonstrated. And I think when we talk about finding faith through community, it requires frequency.
And I think that what you just said is key, and this is key for all of us in community, is that when we come to a point of struggle, a lot of times we back out. Well, you just didn't make the progress that I thought you should make, or you didn't come around to my way of thinking, or you're not more like me now. And I think that really is an anti-Jesus spirit. Because I think we have set expectations on a relationship other than being in relationship, right? And I think that that's critically important. So the issue, 98% of the time, I would say almost 100% of the time, is if I'm unable to love, it's because of me, not so much the person in front of me. I think the second question that I had around this idea of community is sometimes, Brennan, when people think of community, they think of something I go to.
Yes.
And that's not what you're talking about here, right? So are you talking more along the lines of community is something as I do at work, the whole 9 yards?
Yeah, because devotion, compassion, frequency, those aren't things that have to take place in any given spot. Those are all things that point towards a lifestyle of how we approach people around us. So you will naturally find tangible communities, different places. You'll find a work community. You'll find a church community. You'll find a sports community. All those communities are good. But when we talk about faith through community, we're talking about faith through relationship, and relationship can happen anywhere. And so that's why, we started out the episode talking about we want to expand our understanding of community and how we can build faith through that.
Right. And one of the things that is critically important, and I think this really brings us to this point, is that often, like you were saying, a lot of times we think about what we can get out of community. Obviously, we're trying to shift that into, no, we're just going to invest in community for the sake of community. But one of the things that happens, though, if we allow it, is that our own faith can grow because our prejudices, our preconceived ideas, our own rough spots, edges, if we allow it, and sometimes this is why we retreat out of community, is because we don't want to be transparent.
No.
We don't want those areas to be noticed, but if we stick in there, then these things start to be exposed and we can deal with them. We can actually become better humans by being involved in community and better people of faith.
Because encouragement happens through community.
Right.
Right? And there is a terrifying process of when you develop intimacy in community, you really do put yourself out there, right? People will see you for who you are. And that can be a difficult thing, because if there's things you're struggling with or things you don't want to highlight for people, right, you're not naturally going to just start developing intimacy, right? Because you know what comes along with that. Paul makes mention of this in another book or another letter he wrote, Hebrews, right? So I want to point this out.
Maybe he wrote it.
Maybe he wrote part of it. Hebrews 10, it says this, verse 23-25, because I want to point this out. He says, "Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm."
Yep.
All right?
Yep.
So let's devote ourselves.
Yep.
Devotion is required. So hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. So why do we devote? Because we can trust God.
Yep.
So there's our reason for devotion. Okay. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works.
Yes.
There's compassion.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Let's motivate ourselves to love one another.
How do you do that?
How do you do that? Well,
No. I think the verse tells you, doesn't it?
It does. But what I want to point out there is motivation. Let's motivate ourselves. Compassion doesn't just happen.
No, it doesn't.
Okay? And again, this goes back to you and I in our counseling worlds. To grow in compassion requires exercising a part of ourselves that is not easy.
Especially when you're counseling.
Yeah. But compassion comes from building it up. So sometimes you're just going to have to motivate yourself. You're going to have to find a reason to do something you might otherwise not want to do. Right? So how does the verse finish? Well, let's think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works, and let us not neglect our meeting together. All right? There's that gathering, there's that frequency portion that we talked about, as some people do. But encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is growing near. So how do you accomplish that devotion and compassion and frequency? They're all relatable. You got to do them all together in unison to really find that sense of community and growth.
And this is one thing that I think we should say, because most of you know by now, if you've been watching these Brew House episodes or listening to them on podcasts, Brennan and I are pastors, okay? And part of being leaders is, I think we struggle, pastors as a whole, not just us, but we struggle with vulnerability.
Oh, huge.
We struggle with transparency.
Huge.
We actually struggle being in community. Why? Because being a leader, you don't sometimes want people to see your flaws. And when they do, they sometimes don't handle that too well. Fortunately for me, and I do mean this, in which Brendan already knows this, but I consider myself lucky because Brendan and I were actually friends before you came on staff here,
right.
right? Before we pastored together, we were already friends, and so I feel like I work with my friend.
Yep.
And so I feel like that's a bonus for us that maybe some pastors don't have. So I don't want it to come across like he and I have this figured out because we don't. I actually had somebody say to me 2 days ago in an appointment, said, you know, if you feel comfortable to be vulnerable enough to do this. And it took me back because I was like, well, why wouldn't you think I'm vulnerable? But then I thought, I really don't know if I want to be.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Because there's risk attached to
exactly.
that, right? There's risk attached anytime that we are going to build community because it requires something of ourselves that we can get away with scot-free with an individualistic mindset. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the pull in culture has come from, is that we can choose to be very individualistic in nature and just be self-seeking, self-serving, because people won't see it. Mm-hmm. It is something that we can disguise extremely well.
Right.
Because it can look intentional about building community without the apparent of, well, I'm only doing this because I'm getting something out of it.
Right.
And that's where, I mean, Paul and all the apostles really were very aware of this because of Jesus' teaching, that that's not community. Mm-hmm. Community requires us to risk ourselves, to be authentic in our nature, and sometimes it means having difficult conversations. Mm-hmm. Make no mistake about it. If we look at our scriptures that we put our faith in, the disciples argued a lot.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't get along. We talked about it, right? They came from very different places, very different perspectives. And so they would often argue about the most trivial of things because they didn't agree with one another, but they didn't shy away from it either.
Right.
Because Jesus showed them, if you're going to live in community, if you're going to do this, if you're going to carry my mission forward into the world, then you guys got to figure this out. Right. You got to be real. You got to be authentic with one another. And so I think that's an encouragement for us in that, listen, yeah, it's uncomfortable. It's not easy, but you grow through that. You will gain immeasurably more by having those conversations than avoiding them.
And I think a key point coming off of that I think is important is, I'm going to say an emphatic phrase here. All of us need community. All of us need community. There's nobody that I think exists on the planet that says, I don't need somebody.
Yep.
Right? And I think, to be honest with you, I think that we see this being played out right now with the COVID situation. So just coming right out, I'll be totally honest, I'm not a fan of all the restrictions.
Right.
Some of them I think are great, not all of them.
Yep.
Right? One of the things I think is the struggle. So take the financial piece out. For small businesses, I understand that, man. Small businesses are hurting. You know, how come larger entities get exceptions, small businesses don't? I understand that. But I think where most people now are beginning to say enough is enough is around the community piece.
Yeah.
It's my kids need to be involved in, or why can't we go here? Why can't we assemble in our own house? I think that community piece, even though it's hidden in a lot of layers of anger and resentment, that community piece is beginning to resurface because people are saying, hey, I've had enough isolation. I want my community, right?
Well, and this is where, and I'll be vulnerable for a second in my faith approach. So I am excited as we begin transitioning out of COVID.
Oh, we all are.
Because I think we're at that stage. But as we move forward, and this sense of desire for community, that's just going to explode.
Right.
People that have been in isolation for long periods, people that are just, I know people right now that are looking for any excuse that allows them to get out, right? Anything that is technically allowed, they're going to go do, right?
Absolutely.
Because, so this idea of community, people are going to be looking for it. I hope the church is ready to respond to that, because I think the church at its best is just a group of people.
Yep.
That's what Jesus demonstrated.
Yep.
That's what we demonstrated. That's why we talk about, we're not Christians, we're Jesus followers.
Yep.
Right? And what do Jesus followers do? Well, they invest in people.
Right.
They build community.
They shared meals together. They ate together.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, John talks about this, right? He says, let me give you a new command. love one another the same way that I have loved you. You go out and love people the same way Jesus loved you.
And see, that's the key of what you just said. He said, yeah, I have to love people, but I have to love them the way that Jesus loved them.
Not the way I want to love them.
Exactly.
Not the way I think they should be loved.
Right.
The way Jesus loved. So this is what brings us back into our foundation of faith.
Right.
Is we have a great example of how Jesus loved people. How he loved people he disagreed with.
Yep.
How he loved people that crucified him.
Yep.
How he loved people that were in his inner circle. We have examples of all of it.
Yep.
And so when people say, oh, I don't know how Jesus would deal with this situation. I do. Let's go back. We can read the story of Jesus. We can see exactly how he loved people that did not love him.
Yep.
Right? And then it's clear. We're supposed to do that, right? And this is what I love about the statement from Jesus is he says, this is how everyone will recognize that you are my disciples.
Yes. Not
by what they do, but by how they loved.
Right. And not what they believed.
No.
But how they loved.
Right? And so it all comes back to that. Right? In John 17, Jesus actually prays for his disciples. He says this, I pray that you will all be one, just as you and I are one, as you are in me, Father, and I am in you. And may they be in us so that the world will believe you sent me. Now that's a bit of a convoluted passage.
Yep.
In other words, the love we have for each other and the unity we have with each other should convince our community around us to believe in Jesus. Right? Mm-hmm. There is a pastor and a famous theologian, Francis Schaeffer.
Yep.
Who I really enjoy. I've read a lot. He puts it in a very different perspective, maybe something a little more tangible that we can approach. He noted that the observable love of Christians was actually the final apologetic.
Right.
So what does that mean? She wrote a book called Community is Messy, which we'll probably also include in the description of this episode so you guys can check it out. I have the book. I really enjoy the book. It provides some clarity. It says this, apologetics is a branch of theology concerned with the defense of Christian faith. Mm-hmm. And we often think of it in terms of defending the historical and truthfulness of Scripture. Mm-hmm. But Schaeffer makes a statement that moves apologetics from the cerebral to the practical. He states that we, the family of God, the body of Christ, the church, the community that we experience, that should be the ultimate and final proof of God. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, the definitive proof is in the way we relate to one another in community. That is the final apologetic. And that's what Christ demonstrated. Mm-hmm. Christ wasn't concerned about what you or I believed. What he was concerned about was with, I keep messing with this table. You and I got to switch sides. For people that can't watch online, we have a movable desk. It's adjustable, and I keep tweaking it.
It's okay, man.
But you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. The way that we live in community, the way that we live with others, our compassion, our devotion, right? That is what is going to direct people towards Jesus.
Yep.
Nothing else.
Right.
That is what is.
Right. And so I think with that, and maybe a couple of closing thoughts is, this idea of community, which is involvement, which involves love, which involves not seeing everybody as adversarial. They're not against you. You're not against them. Yep. Jesus didn't see himself as against people.
No, just for people.
Yep, which I think is huge. And I think the other thing you might agree with is that the other inhibitor that keeps us from this is that we have to lay down sometimes our need to be right.
That's a hard one.
And it is. And maybe we'll talk about that in future episodes. But I would say that listening to everything that you've shared, what we've talked about, I would say that this idea of love cannot be overstated. It has to become a priority. We have to be motivated by love to engage in community and stay in it. Would you agree with that?
100% agree.
All right, guys.
Agree.
Well, listen, next week we'll have another episode for you. Drum Roasters Coffee. Again, Curtis, thank you for sending us this. Great espresso right here. Talk to you later.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.